Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's weathered hands traced the chart spread across his flagship's war room table, his fingers pausing at the tiny speck labeled Midway Atoll in the vast Pacific Ocean. The date was May 28, 1942, and Japan's greatest naval strategist was about to make the most catastrophic miscalculation of his brilliant career. The morning briefing aboard the battleship Yamato had concluded, with unanimous agreement from his staff officers. Operation MI would deliver the knockout blow that had eluded them at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. By seizing Midway, they would force the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive engagement where Japan's superior numbers and experience would crush the remnants of Admiral Chester Nimitz's forces. "The Americans cannot ignore an attack on Midway," declared Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet. His 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the most potent naval striking force ever assembled. These were the same ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and swept British naval power from the Indian Ocean. "Their fleet will sail into our trap, and we will finish what we began in December." Yamamoto nodded, though something nagged at his strategic instincts. The plan's complexity troubled him: a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, a carrier strike on Midway, followed by an amphibious landing, all coordinated with the main battle fleet, positioned to destroy the inevitable American response. Too many moving parts, too many opportunities for miscommunication or delay. But his confidence in Japanese naval supremacy overrode his concerns. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Navy had suffered not a single significant defeat. Their pilots were veterans of the China conflict, their ships the finest in the world, their tactics proven in a dozen victories. The Americans, by contrast, were amateurs thrust into a war they were unprepared to fight. Captain Kuroshima, Yamamoto's chief of staff, spread intelligence reports across the table. "American naval strength in the Central Pacific remains minimal. Our estimates indicate they can deploy no more than 2 carriers, perhaps 3 if they rush the damaged Yorktown back into service. Against our 4 carriers and supporting battle fleet, they cannot hope to prevail." The intelligence assessment represented the first critical miscalculation. Japanese reconnaissance had failed to account for the full extent of American carrier availability. And more importantly, they had no idea that their most sensitive communications were being intercepted and decoded by American cryptanalysts. Unknown to Yamamoto and his staff, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Haipo in Pearl Harbor had been reading Japanese naval codes for months. The United States was aware of Japanese communication codes in early 1942. The attack location and time were confirmed when the American base at Midway sent out a false message that it was short of fresh water, according to records from the National World War II Museum. This deception had confirmed beyond doubt that AF, the target designation in intercepted Japanese messages, referred to Midway Atoll. While Yamamoto refined his battle plans, Admiral Nimitz was positioning his own forces with foreknowledge of Japanese intentions. Task Force 16 under Admiral Raymond Spruance and Task Force 17 under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher were already moving toward their ambush positions northeast of Midway. The second miscalculation involved timing. Yamamoto's complex plan required precise coordination between widely separated forces. The diversionary attack on Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians was scheduled for June 3rd, followed by the carrier strike on Midway on June 4th, with the main engagement expected on June 5th or 6th. This rigid timetable left no margin for error, bad weather, or unexpected resistance. As the Japanese fleet steamed eastward through the North Pacific, Yamamoto remained confident in his strategy. His forces outnumbered the Americans in every category: carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. His pilots had combat experience that their American counterparts could not match. The element of surprise, he believed, remained firmly on his side. But in the radio intercept stations of Pearl Harbor, American codebreakers were tracking every major unit of the Japanese fleet. They knew the composition of Nagumo's carrier force, the timing of the attack, and even the frequencies his aircraft would use during the battle. The hunters had become the hunted, though Yamamoto would not realize this fatal reversal until his carriers were burning in the Pacific swells. The stage was set for what would become one of the most decisive naval battles in history, where Japanese assumptions about American weakness would collide with the reality of American preparation and determination. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of his flagship Akagi as his carrier force approached their launch position northwest of Midway Atoll on the morning of June 4, 1942. The rising sun painted the Pacific swells gold, and visibility stretched to the horizon. Perfect flying weather for what should have been another routine demonstration of Japanese naval supremacy. But Nagumo had failed to appreciate how the unique geography of Midway Atoll would negate many of his tactical advantages. The twin islands of Sand and Eastern sat barely 6 feet above sea level, connected by a coral reef that created a natural harbor. This seemingly insignificant terrain feature would prove crucial to the battle's outcome. Unlike the sprawling naval bases of Pearl Harbor or Manila Bay, Midway's compact geography concentrated its defensive capabilities into a small but formidable fortress. Every square yard of the atoll bristled with anti-aircraft guns, coastal artillery, and radar installations. The Americans had transformed these tiny coral specks into an unsinkable aircraft carrier, positioned precisely where it could threaten Japanese supply lines to the Central Pacific. Nagumo's intelligence briefings had underestimated both Midway's defensive strength and its strategic value. Japanese planners viewed the atoll as merely a stepping stone to Hawaii, failing to understand that its position made it the keystone of American Pacific defenses. From Midway, American patrol aircraft could monitor Japanese movements across a 1,000-mile radius, while its airstrips could launch bombing raids against any Japanese force attempting to advance eastward. At 0430 hours, Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway, 108 aircraft from all 4 carriers. Leading the formation, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga reported clear skies and excellent visibility as his bombers and fighters approached their target. But the Americans were waiting. Marine Fighter Squadron 221, flying obsolescent Brewster, Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats, rose to meet the incoming Japanese formation. Though outclassed by the veteran Japanese pilots in their superior Zeros, the Marine aviators bought precious time with their lives. Their sacrifice allowed Midway's anti-aircraft gunners to prepare for the onslaught. The terrain itself became an ally to the defenders. Midway's flat coral surface provided little cover for aircraft or installations, but it also meant that every Japanese bomb needed precise placement to achieve maximum effect. The atoll's small size concentrated American defenses, creating overlapping fields of fire that no attacking aircraft could avoid. As Tominaga's bombers swept over the atoll, they encountered defensive fire unlike anything they had experienced in previous campaigns. The Americans had learned from Pearl Harbor, positioning their most valuable assets in hardened shelters and dispersing their aircraft to prevent catastrophic losses. While the Japanese attack inflicted significant damage, it failed to neutralize Midway as an operational base. Tominaga's radio message to Nagumo at 0700 hours contained ominous news. There is need for a second attack. The terrain that Japanese planners had dismissed as insignificant had absorbed their best punch and remained defiant. But Nagumo faced a dilemma that the restrictive coral geography of Midway had helped create. His carriers were operating in constrained waters, with limited maneuvering room due to the proximity of the atoll's defensive perimeter. Unlike the vast expanses of the Indian Ocean where his carriers had operated with impunity, the approaches to Midway forced his ships into predictable patterns that American patrol aircraft could easily track. Even more critically, Midway's position relative to the Hawaiian Islands created what naval strategists call interior lines of communication for the Americans. While Nagumo's forces were strung out across hundreds of miles of ocean, his carriers northwest of Midway, his battleships trailing far behind, his invasion force approaching from the southwest, Admiral Nimitz could coordinate his response from the secure base at Pearl Harbor, just over 1,000 miles away. The atoll's airstrips, though damaged by the morning attack, remained operational. Marine and Navy pilots continued launching attacks against Nagumo's carriers throughout the morning, keeping the Japanese admiral focused on immediate threats rather than the broader tactical situation. Each wave of attackers from Midway, though, suffering heavy casualties, forced Nagumo to maintain combat air patrols and keep his own aircraft armed for defense, rather than offensive operations. Unknown to Nagumo, American carrier aircraft were already approaching from the northeast, guided by radio intelligence that had pinpointed his exact position. The terrain that confined his tactical options was about to become the stage for his destruction. The vast Pacific that had seemed to offer endless room for maneuver had suddenly contracted into a killing ground where Japanese advantages in experience and equipment would prove meaningless against American preparation and position. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting short shadows across Midway's coral surfaces, the atoll's true strategic value was becoming apparent. It was not just a base to be captured or destroyed, it was the bait in a trap that would break the back of Japanese naval aviation. In the Combat Information Center aboard the USS Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance studied the latest intelligence, reports with the quiet satisfaction of a chess player who could see 5 moves ahead. The date was June 4th, 1942, and American codebreakers had handed him the greatest advantage in naval history, perfect knowledge of his enemy's intentions. While Admiral Nagumo's carriers launched their dawn strike against Midway, Spruance knew the exact composition of the Japanese force, their planned movements, and even their radio frequencies. This intelligence coup represented a fundamental miscalculation by Japanese naval security, one that would prove far more decisive than any tactical error. The roots of Japan's intelligence disaster stretched back to the previous year, when American cryptanalysts had begun making progress against the Japanese naval code system, known as JN-25. Unlike the diplomatic codes that had been partially broken before Pearl Harbor, JN-25 encrypted the most sensitive operational communications of the Imperial Navy. Its compromise gave American commanders unprecedented insight into Japanese strategic thinking. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the brilliant and eccentric chief of Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, had dedicated his life to breaking Japanese codes. Working in a basement bunker beneath the Navy Yard, Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts, linguists, and mathematicians had achieved what many considered impossible: real-time intelligence on Japanese naval operations. The breakthrough had come in May, when Station Hypo intercepted references to a major operation against AF, a target designation that appeared repeatedly in Japanese message traffic. Rochefort suspected AF referred to Midway, but Admiral Nimitz demanded proof before committing his limited forces to what might be a Japanese deception. The confirmation came through a stroke of brilliant deception. On Nimitz's orders, Midway's garrison sent an unencrypted radio message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down and requesting emergency supplies. Within days, Japanese intelligence reported that AF was short of fresh water, confirming beyond doubt that Midway was the target. But Japanese overconfidence in their code security represented only part of their intelligence failure. Admiral Yamamoto's staff had also grievously underestimated American naval strength in the Pacific. Their calculations showed only 2 or 3 American carriers available to respond to the Midway operation, when in fact, Nimitz had positioned 3 carrier task forces to intercept the Japanese fleet. The most critical intelligence error involved the USS Yorktown. Japanese aviators believed they had sunk the carrier during the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May. In reality, the ship had limped back to Pearl Harbor with severe damage, but remained afloat. In a Herculean effort, Navy repair crews had worked around the clock to make Yorktown battle-ready, completing in 3 days repairs that should have taken 3 months. As Spruance's task force approached the Japanese fleet on the morning of June 4th, American radio intercept stations continued, monitoring Japanese communications in real time. Every course change, every airstrike launch, every tactical decision by Nagumo's force was known to American commanders within minutes of its execution. The intelligence advantage extended beyond strategic planning to tactical execution. American pilots had been briefed on the exact composition of Nagumo's force, the capabilities of Japanese aircraft, and even the personalities of enemy commanders. They knew that Admiral Nagumo was cautious and methodical, that his air group commanders were aggressive, and that Japanese doctrine emphasized concentrated attacks over flexible response. Meanwhile, Nagumo operated in virtual blindness. His reconnaissance aircraft had failed to locate the American carrier forces, while his intelligence officers, continued to insist that no more than 2 American carriers could be in the area. Japanese naval intelligence had become so confident in their own superiority that they dismissed contrary evidence as American propaganda or deception. The disparity in intelligence quality became apparent as the morning battle developed. While American commanders tracked every movement of the Japanese fleet, Nagumo remained unaware that 3 American carrier task forces were converging on his position. His first indication of serious trouble came at 0728 hours, when a Japanese reconnaissance plane reported sighting American ships to the northeast. Even then, the pilot's initial report mentioned only cruisers and destroyers. The crucial addendum, "Enemy appears to be accompanied by a carrier," did not reach Nagumo until nearly an hour later, by which time American dive bombers were already approaching his fleet. This communication delay represented the final link in Japan's intelligence catastrophe. Not only had they failed to detect American preparations, but their own information systems proved inadequate for real-time tactical decision-making. While American radio discipline and communication procedures had been refined through months of practice, Japanese communications remained formal, hierarchical, and slow. As the decisive moment of the battle approached, the intelligence imbalance had created an impossible situation for Japanese forces. They were fighting blind against an enemy who could anticipate their every move, led by commanders who understood their capabilities better than they understood themselves. The code-breaking achievement that made this possible would later be recognized as one of the most significant intelligence victories in military history, comparable to the breaking of the German Enigma code in the Atlantic Theater. At 0920 hours on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey faced the most critical decision of his naval career. Leading 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise, he had reached the calculated interception point for the Japanese carrier force and found empty ocean stretching to every horizon. McCluskey's fuel gauges showed barely enough aviation gasoline for the return flight to Enterprise, and his squadron commanders were requesting permission to abort the mission. But something in the veteran pilot's instincts told him to continue the search. Banking his formation to the southwest, McCluskey followed a hunch that would change the course of naval history. Below him, Admiral Nagumo's carrier force was experiencing the chaos that resulted from Japan's third critical miscalculation, the timing of their operations. Nagumo had planned to launch a second strike against Midway, while maintaining half his aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship operations. But the persistent attacks from Midway's defenders had forced him to commit all available fighters to defensive patrols, leaving his carriers vulnerable at precisely the wrong moment. The morning had begun with such promise for the Japanese. Lieutenant Tominaga's strike against Midway had inflicted significant damage, though the American garrison remained defiant. More troubling was Tominaga's recommendation for a second attack, which would require rearming his aircraft with high-explosive bombs rather than the anti-ship weapons they currently carried. Nagumo faced an impossible choice. Intelligence reports suggested American surface ships in the area, though their exact composition remained unclear. Should he rearm for a second land attack or maintain his anti-ship capability? The decision would prove fatal. At 0745 hours, Nagumo ordered his aircraft rearmed with high-explosive bombs for the second Midway strike. Across his 4 carriers, ordnance crews began the laborious process of changing out torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for land attack munitions. Aviation gasoline lines snaked across flight decks as aircraft were refueled. Armed bombs and torpedoes sat exposed on hangar decks, waiting to be moved to storage magazines. But at 0820 hours, the Japanese reconnaissance plane that had been shadowing the American formation finally transmitted the message that changed everything. Enemy force accompanied by carrier bearing 08 degrees, distance 180 miles. American carriers were not only present, but within striking range. Nagumo immediately ordered another reversal. His aircraft would be rearmed again, this time with anti-ship weapons. But time was now working against him. The rearming process that should have taken 30 minutes was stretching toward an hour. Fuel lines remained connected to aircraft. Armed ordnance cluttered the decks. His carriers had become floating ammunition dumps. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's torpedo squadron. 8 from the USS Hornet found Nagumo's force first. Leading 15 obsolescent Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, Waldron pressed home his attack with suicidal courage. Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire slaughtered his squadron. Only one pilot survived, but their sacrifice served a crucial purpose. The torpedo attack forced every Japanese fighter down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. At 0:10:22 hours, McCluskey's dive bombers appeared over the Japanese fleet like avenging angels. Following the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the formation, McCluskey had found his targets spread out below him in perfect attack formation. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu lay exposed, their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. "This is it, boys. Remember Pearl Harbor." McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio as he pushed his Dauntless into its 70-degree dive toward the carrier Kaga. Behind him, 36 more dive bombers followed in textbook formation, their pilots selecting targets with the precision of veterans despite their relative inexperience. The attack that followed lasted less than 6 minutes, but changed the balance of naval power in the Pacific forever. Lieutenant Dick Best's bomb penetrated Akagi's flight deck and detonated in the hangar, igniting the aviation gasoline and ordnance that Nagumo's rushed rearming operation had left exposed. Kaga suffered multiple direct hits that turned her into a floating inferno. Soryu, caught with aircraft warming up on her flight deck, was mortally wounded by a single well-placed bomb. The timing that Japanese planners had calculated so carefully had become their executioner. Caught between missions, their most powerful ships had been transformed into their own destroyers. The ordnance meant to devastate American forces became the instrument of Japanese defeat. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag from the burning Akagi to the light cruiser Nagara, could only watch as the striking power that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months disappeared in towering columns of smoke and flame. 3 of his 4 carriers were lost, their experienced air groups dead or scattered. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, managed to launch a retaliatory strike that crippled the USS Yorktown, but American dive bombers found her too by late afternoon. By sunset on June 4, 1942, Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, over 300 aircraft, and most irreplaceably, the experienced pilots who had given the Imperial Navy its edge in the Pacific War. Japan's leaders had indeed miscalculated timing, terrain, and American tenacity, but most fatally, they had miscalculated the price of their own overconfidence. Captain Tameichi Hara stood on the bridge of the destroyer Hamikaze as she raced through the pre-dawn darkness of June 5, 1942, desperately searching for survivors from the carrier Hiryu. Around him, the remnants of the once mighty combined fleet fled westward in disorder, their retreat marking the end of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. The magnitude of the disaster was still sinking in. In less than 24 hours, Admiral Nagumo's mobile force had been annihilated. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay on the ocean floor, along with over 300 aircraft and most of their irreplaceable pilots. The striking force that had humbled Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and swept British naval power from the Indian Ocean had simply ceased to exist. Aboard his flagship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto faced the most bitter moment of his distinguished career. The intelligence reports coming in painted a picture of complete tactical defeat. Not only had the Americans known about Operation MI in advance, but they had turned Japan's own overconfidence into a weapon of devastating effectiveness. The 4th critical miscalculation was now becoming apparent. Japan's leaders had fundamentally misunderstood American industrial capacity and national determination. They had assumed that a series of stunning defeats would force the United States to negotiate a favorable peace, as Japan had done with Russia after the Battle of Tsushima, straight in 1905. Instead, each Japanese victory had only hardened American resolve while mobilizing the world's most powerful industrial economy for total war. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the air group commander who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and was now recovering from appendicitis aboard Akagi, witnessed the final moments of his ship. As flames consumed the carrier that had been his home for 2 years, Fuchida understood that Japan had not merely lost a battle, they had lost the war. "We never suspected," That the enemy had such precise information, Fuchida would later write. The Americans knew our every move while we operated in complete ignorance of their preparations. It was not just our ships that were outmaneuvered, but our entire intelligence system. The human cost of Japan's miscalculations extended far beyond the ships and aircraft lost at Midway. In the blazing wreckage of 4 carriers died the veteran pilots who had made Japanese naval aviation the most feared force in the Pacific. These men represented years of training and combat experience that could not be quickly replaced. Japan had entered the war with approximately 1,500 experienced carrier pilots. By war's end, most would be dead. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, one of the few senior Japanese aviators to survive Midway, recognized the strategic implications immediately. We lost not just our ships, but our ability to train new pilots. The Americans can replace their losses within months. For us, each experienced pilot lost is irreplaceable. The ripple effects of defeat spread throughout the Japanese Empire. Plans for further expansion in the Pacific were immediately canceled. The invasion of Australia, already postponed due to logistical constraints, became impossible. Most critically, Japan's defensive perimeter, which had seemed impregnable just days before, now appeared dangerously exposed. Admiral Nimitz, monitoring Japanese communications from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, understood that the victory at Midway had fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Pacific. American intelligence intercepts showed Japanese forces withdrawing from advanced positions, consolidating their defenses, and shifting from offensive to defensive planning. The enemy has lost the initiative and will never regain it, Nimitz wrote in his assessment to Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations. Our victory at Midway has broken not just their naval strength, but their confidence in inevitable victory. The psychological impact of defeat proved as devastating as the material losses. For 6 months, Japanese forces had advanced from victory to victory, seemingly unstoppable in their conquest of Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated by decades of military success, shattered against the coral reefs of Midway Atoll. Emperor Hirohito, receiving news of the defeat in the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, reportedly remained silent for several minutes before asking, "How can this have happened?" The emperor's naval aide, Admiral Nagano, could offer no satisfactory explanation. Japan's best admirals had led their finest ships into battle against inferior forces and suffered catastrophic defeat. The strategic miscalculation that had led to Midway reflected deeper flaws in Japanese military thinking. The doctrine of decisive battle, which had served Japan well against China and Russia, proved inadequate against an industrial democracy capable of absorbing losses and replacing them with interest. American shipyards were already laying down keels for carriers that would dwarf anything in the Japanese fleet, while aircraft factories prepared production lines for fighters and bombers that would darken Pacific skies. But perhaps the most telling miscalculation involved the character of their enemy. Japanese leaders had convinced themselves that Americans were soft, pleasure-loving, and incapable of the sacrifice necessary for prolonged warfare. The reality they discovered at Midway was far different. An enemy as determined and resourceful as themselves, backed by industrial might that Japan could never match. As the broken remnants of the combined fleet limped back toward Japan, Admiral Fine-Tint Yamamoto understood that his nation had passed the point of no return. The war that was supposed to end in 6 months would now continue for years, and Japan lacked the resources to win such a contest. 6 months after the catastrophe at Midway, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his study at the combined fleet headquarters in Truk Lagoon, staring at intelligence reports that confirmed his worst fears about America's industrial mobilization. The date was December 4th, 1942, and the strategic miscalculations that had led to defeat at Midway were compounding into a disaster of unprecedented proportions. The numbers told a story of mathematical inevitability. American ice shipyards were launching new aircraft carriers at a rate that defied Japanese comprehension. The USS Essex, first of a new class of fleet carriers, had been commissioned in December, followed by more ships rolling down the ways every few months. Meanwhile, Japan struggled to complete even a single replacement for the 4 carriers lost at Midway. Yamamoto's staff briefings painted an increasingly grim picture. American aircraft production had reached levels that seemed impossible. Over 47,000 planes manufactured in 1942 alone, compared to Japan's 8,800. The pilot training programs that Japan had neglected while relying on pre-war veterans were producing American aviators at 5 times the rate of their Japanese counterparts. The admiral who had warned his government that America would prove a formidable enemy was witnessing his prophecies come true with devastating precision. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve," Yamamoto had reportedly said after Pearl Harbor. Now, barely 1 year later, that giant was stretching its industrial muscles with frightening effect. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, Yamamoto's intelligence chief, delivered the latest assessment of American naval construction. By mid-1943, the enemy will possess more aircraft carriers than we have ever built. Their pilot training programs are graduating more aviators each month than we lost at Midway. The technological gap was widening as well. American EI&DO radar systems, barely functional at the time of Pearl Harbor, had evolved into sophisticated networks that gave their forces unprecedented situational awareness. The same intelligence capabilities that had doomed Nagumo's carriers at Midway were being refined and expanded, making it increasingly difficult for Japanese forces to achieve tactical surprise. But the most damning evidence of Japan's strategic miscalculation came from the battlefield itself. At Guadalcanal, where Japanese and American forces had been locked in brutal combat since August, the tide was turning decisively against the Empire. Japanese pilots, many of them hastily trained replacements for the veterans lost at Midway, were being systematically outfought by American aviators with superior aircraft and equipment. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest fighter aces, had been shot down over Guadalcanal and barely survived the flight back to base with severe injuries. His report to Naval Headquarters contained uncomfortable truths about American capabilities. The enemy pilots are no longer the amateurs we faced at the beginning of the war. They have learned from their defeats and adapted their tactics. Meanwhile, our own replacement pilots lack the experience needed for effective combat. The human cost of Japan's miscalculations was becoming apparent throughout the Pacific. The experienced flight crews who had given Japanese naval aviation its edge were being ground down in a war of attrition they could not win. Each veteran pilot lost represented years of training and combat experience that Japan's accelerated replacement programs could not duplicate. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the carrier commander whose force had been destroyed at Midway, now found himself assigned to shore duties in Japan. His replacement, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, faced the impossible task of rebuilding Japanese carrier aviation with inexperienced pilots and insufficient aircraft. The new air groups bore little resemblance to the elite formations that had dominated the Pacific in early 1942. Emperor Hirohito, receiving increasingly pessimistic reports from his military advisors, began to question the fundamental assumptions that had led Japan into war with America. The quick victory that had been promised was receding into an ever more distant future, while American industrial might was transforming the Pacific into an increasingly dangerous environment for Japanese forces. The intelligence reports reaching Tokyo painted a picture of systematic American preparation for a war of unprecedented scale. Liberty ships were being launched faster than German U-boats could sink them. Aircraft factories were operating around the clock, producing fighters, bombers, and transport planes in quantities that strained Japanese comprehension. Most ominously, American universities and research laboratories were mobilizing scientific resources that suggested technological developments beyond anything Japan could match. Dr. Robert Oppenheimer's Manhattan Project remained unknown to Japanese intelligence, but other American scientific initiatives were becoming apparent. Radar technology, sonar systems, proximity fuses, and improved aircraft engines were giving American forces qualitative advantages to match their growing quantitative superiority. As 1942 drew to a close, the strategic situation that Japanese leaders had so badly miscalculated was crystallizing into mathematical certainty. America's industrial capacity, mobilized for total war, was producing military equipment at rates that made victory impossible for Japan to achieve. The empire that had seemed invincible just 6 months earlier was discovering that it had challenged an opponent whose resources dwarfed its own. Yamamoto understood that Midway had been more than a tactical defeat. It had been the moment when Japan's fundamental strategic assumptions collapsed beneath the weight of American industrial reality. The war that was supposed to be won quickly through decisive battle had become a grinding contest of production and replacement that favored the side with the deeper industrial base. The sleeping giant was not only awake, but building an arsenal that would reshape the Pacific forever.